right, hello everyone. So today we're going to be continuing what we started talking about yesterday, which is the Cold War. So we have to start off with talking about China. So, just a little bit of backstory. There had been a Chinese civil war going on since the 1920s. So it was between, you had had the communists versus the nationalists, and basically they only really stopped fighting to unite against the Japanese. And so, World War II made it to where there was a truce temporarily between these two sides because they wanted to go after the Japanese. And then, whenever war ended, everything went back to the way it was. You had many dynasties throughout China. And so, the last one before this civil war was the Qing dynasty, and it collapsed in 1911. And there was essentially like a vacuum of power in China. And so, those two major parties formed, the Nationalist and the Communist Party. And so in 1927, this rivalry ends up becoming a war. So from 1927 to 1936, you have the two sides that are fighting. You have Mao Zedong, who led peasants and common people in uprisings against the nationalists, and Chiang Kai shek, the leader of the Nationalist Party, tried to put down the uprisings and eliminate Mao and the CPC, which is the Chinese Communist Party. So when the Japanese invaded China in 1937, the CPC, like I had said, they had united in order to defend their homeland. Now, fast forward to the end of World War II in 1945. The two sides basically resumed their war. The Americans supported Chiang Kai shek and took over control of China's major cities, essentially. However, the CPC, or the communists, they were very heavily funded by the Soviet Union, and so that worked out really well for them. Now, in October of 1949, the communists captured Beijing, and they declared victory and said that China was now under rule of the communists, and the nationalists essentially flee to Taiwan and they established their own government. But this was seen as the fall of China. And so this right here pictured is Mao Zedong. And so whenever China falls to communism, the United States does not recognize him as the legitimate ruler. However, he was the ruler in China, and this is seen as the first failure of containment, or keeping communism contained and not letting it spread. So we are moving on to talk about the Korean War. Some of you may have people in your family who served. My grandpa actually served in Korea. If you're ever in Washington, D.C., the Korean War Memorial is so awesome. Go see it. So, as far as Korea is concerned, it was the first major conflict of the Cold War. So, Japan had formerly annexed Korea and occupied it. Then they divided North and South Korea at the 38th parallel, which you see here pictured. Now, the United States had proposed elections in both of the Koreas. North Korea was not a fan, thought that voting wouldn't be fair, and so North and South were supposed to hold separate elections. So after they had become separate nations, they each wanted to invade each other. Each wanted their allies to help them. And the Soviets did not want to deal with the United States and didn't think we wanted to interfere, since we didn't in the Chinese Civil War. So the Chinese are going to help the North Koreans. The North Koreans were way more prepared than the South Koreans. For example, there were no tanks in South Korea, and there were 280 in North Korea. So tensions are going to mount over time. And so things will only get hotter and hotter as far as in Korea. So June 25th, 1950, Northern Korean communists invade South Korea in a surprise attack. South Korea didn't have a chance. The North Koreans, they took Seoul. You can see Seoul right here in the yellow circle. The North was very powerful. Syngman Rhee, who was the leader of South Korea, ordered all communists in South Korea actually to be killed, and that went on for a while. The United States did not initially want to get involved, but the quick falling of China and the fast assumption of power had really scared the Americans. Incheon, which is actually located right in here near Seoul, well, relatively near Seoul. This is really like the one battle essentially we're really gonna talk about. It was one of the most daring yet successful amphibious assaults in history. It was a surprise. Seoul was close, and we had wanted to liberate people that were in Seoul. And so it was very hard to get to. So it was much easier to get to through water. So we were able to cut North Korean forces in half. And it does turn the tide of the war for a while. What was interesting is we talked about in battle or with D-Day and the liberation of France using deception and so on. Well, this was also used here. Like they, the South Koreans and the Americans, people that were involved on the South Korean side, they would bombard other places to distract the North Korean armies and make them think that the battle was actually going to be, or the attack was really going to be elsewhere. So that was pretty interesting to see how they did that. But it was successful, and it ended up pushing North Koreans out. Harry Truman did not want to invade North Korea because he feared Chinese interference. So General MacArthur, who was in charge of this entire assault and so on, he said that the Chinese wouldn't intervene, but eventually they did. Remember, they had joined and they had really helped the North Koreans during this time. So Harry Truman was right. So what ends up happening is, and we'll go back actually real quick over here. Here's the 38th parallel. Truman had not wanted us to push north of the parallel. And so he ends up doing this. And Truman ordered MacArthur and the military to back off, only wanted to focus on South Korea. And so not to push to the north, but to focus on South Korea. MacArthur wanted to take the war to China, right up here. And so Truman said, keep your views to yourself, and you're supposed to obey orders. Turns out that he did not keep his views to himself. General MacArthur wrote a letter to the Republican Speaker of the House criticizing Truman openly. This was seen as insubordination, and General MacArthur is relieved of service. He is fired publicly, and this is actually the letter regarding that. And so MacArthur actually returns to the United States to a hero's welcome. Like, they had parades, like ticker tape parades. He was asked to speak before Congress. And so what ends up happening is a lot of the United States public opinion shifted for Truman. However, and shifted negatively, I'm sorry. And so what ends up happening is Truman sticks to his guns. And he did not apologize for what he did. He did not regret it. And eventually, the American people did realize that Harry Truman made the right decision. If we would attack China, or like MacArthur wanted to do, and drop a bomb on them, it could have escalated much, much worse. And so that's how that went. Now, we do see the war go on for a couple more years, and it ends in a ceasefire, and there roughly are the same borders as before the war even happened. This was seen as a success for containment. No, we did not push into the north and take back lands and get rid of communism. But as far as for containing communism, it was seen as a success. Now you have this demilitarized zone that is heavily guarded, Panmunjom. And so this right here is very similar to the way things are today. Now, let's talk about the Cold War at home. We talked about over in Asia. Now, we'll talk about Cold War at home. So, there is rampant fear of communism again in the United States. It had kind of taken a little bit of a lull. There was still fear, but, with the heightening of tensions with the Cold War and the Korean War, things turn around again. So, the Soviet Union develops the atomic bomb, and that makes things worse. And so, people who are very anti-communist, they think that Truman's being soft on communism as far as containment is concerned. So what ends up happening is you see what's called a witch hunt during the time. So if you'll take a look, you can see that there were loyalty review boards. If you were a government employee, no matter what level, and someone accused you of being a communist, whether they had any kind of evidence or whether it was good evidence or not, you were not allowed to see it, and you had to be investigated. Now, the House of the Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC is what it was called, it investigates Hollywood and how communists had supposedly infiltrated into Hollywood. So you have here the Hollywood 10. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, not all 10 people are pictured here, okay? But these were up and coming different people within Hollywood, and they'd have really, promising careers. However, they did not cooperate with these investigations and were blacklisted. Their careers cut off, and they were stalled because they didn't cooperate with these different investigations. Now, you do hear in different, movies in Hollywood and so on about spies during the time. And there were a couple of major cases of spies in the United States. So, first of all, at the top, you have Alger Hiss. He was tried for being a Soviet spy. In the end, he is convicted of perjury. And so he himself was actually involved in the establishment of the United Nations, both as a State Department official and a UN official. And he was very important. People knew who he was. He maintained his innocence until his death, but later on, they discovered evidence that he probably was a spy by different papers and interceptions of telegrams, things like that. So very interesting. Take a look into Alger Hiss if you ever have time, / if you're ever interested. At the bottom, you have the Rosenbergs. They may be people that you recognize a little more. They were accused of passing nuclear secrets that were vital to the development of the atomic bomb. Later on, it was discovered they were part of a larger ring, but they were only 2 people out of a large operation. What's interesting is they were it looked like average people. They had, kids and everything. Actually, later on, their kids tried to clear their names, but declassified information shows that we now have shows that Julius was definitely guilty of selling secrets or passing secrets to the Soviets, and Ethel was complicit. She knew what was going on. But what's crazy to think about is their entire investigation, it was made into a big deal, but they were a small fry in terms of, who was like the bigger fish and who was giving different secrets surrounding the Manhattan Project. The government had bigger fish to fry, but he just happened to get caught, is what I was trying to say. And what another turn that this actually took is that Julius claimed that it was based around anti-Semitism. And so there were a lot of questions about that. But eventually they were both they were executed, and that was by way of the electric chair. So these were 2 hot cases of spies during the time. So Joseph McCarthy, you'll talk about him in English class. So basically, he was a Wisconsin senator who came to fame through his different communist hearings. So basically, what he did was he made unsupported accusations of communism. And there were these different loyalty review boards, and he would be taking the lead on them. He goes on blaming different groups of people. And one party he blames is the Democrat Party, or one group of people is the Democrat Party. He calls out different names, and this is actually where Richard Nixon gains prominence because he works closely with Joseph McCarthy. And the Republicans don't really rein him in because they see that he was, going after communists, and they were very fearful of the communists. And so eventually later in his life, he is investigated, and they figure out that he had been doing some very shady things. People had basically their careers ruined and were shamed publicly, based on nothing, no serious amount of evidence. And so people really started to look down on McCarthy whenever he accuses the army of some different nefarious acts. And so he goes from being very prominent, people listening to him and thinking what he said was the truth, to declining quickly, and he ends up dying shortly after his stint as senator. And so this was truly a dark chapter as far as civil rights are concerned in the United States.